Good evening, everyone. I'm Jennifer Gonzalez, Professor of History of Art and Visual Culture and Faculty Co-Director of the Institute of the Arts and Sciences. And I'm delighted to welcome you this evening to our Traction Art Talk series. We have a wonderful lineup of speakers this year. In addition to our guests tonight, other speakers include Isaac Julian, Sanford Biggers, Sharon Hayes, and Dred Scott, offering wonderful opportunities to hear from some of the most important living artists of our present moment. Before I introduce our two guests tonight, I would like to mention that we will have time for questions at the end of the presentation. Feel free to use the Q&A function throughout the discussion as questions arise. We'll be checking these questions at the end of the event and responding to as many as we can in the time allowed. So it gives me great pleasure to now introduce our Traction Art Talk speaker, Ken Gonzales-Day. Ken Gonzales-Day is a Los Angeles-based artist whose interdisciplinary practice considers the historical construction of race and the limits of representational systems, ranging from lynching photographs to museum displays. His widely exhibited Erased Lynching series, which is ongoing, along with the publication of Lynching in the West, 180 to 1935 from Duke University Press in 2006, transformed the understanding of racialized violence in the United States, and specifically raised awareness of the lynching of Latinos, Native Americans, Asians, and African Americans in California, and helped to recontextualize anti-immigration histories with the larger discussion of racial formation. Works from the profiled series have been exhibited internationally and grew out of research into the history of racial depiction found in historic expositions and educational museum displays. In 2017, Gonzales-Day received a Guggenheim Fellowship in Photography and currently holds the Fletcher Jones Chair in Art at Scripps College and is represented by Luis de Jesus Gallery in Los Angeles. Gonzales-Day received a BFA from Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, an MFA from the University of California, Irvine, and an MA from Hunter College in New York. He is a professor. Oh, I already said where he was a professor. What I wanted to say is that his work has been widely exhibited, including at LACMA in Los Angeles, LAX Art, Tamayo Museum in Mexico City, Palais de Tokyo in Paris, the New Museum in New York, the Generali Foundation, Vienna, and many others. So Ken, please join us. Nice to see you. Ken will be in conversation tonight with our wonderful colleague, Karolina Karlic, an associate professor in the art department here at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and the head of the photography area. Karlic is a photographer and creates work that widely addresses the intersection of photography, ethnofiction, and documentary practices, with a focus on systems of labor and industry, globalization, and their impact on the social and environmental landscape. Karlic has been the recipient of numerous fellowships, residencies, and awards, including the John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship. I look forward to hearing from you both, and I will join you at the end of your conversation. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ken, for joining us today, and for all of you joining us from distant places. I hope that you are all well and safe during this time. I want to extend a warm welcome also to those of you that are visiting us via Zoom, whether through classrooms or in a recording. I also want to extend a thank you to Rachel Nelson, who is the director of the Institute of Arts and Sciences at UCSC, and to thank Chloe Moore, who has helped as well to set up this webinar. And thank you, Jennifer Gonzalez, for facilitating and introducing us and facilitating our later Q&A. I also want to thank the UCSC Arts Division and the UCSC Art Department. Before I get started, I also want to acknowledge that I am in my studio standing at the UCSC campus. And I want to acknowledge that the land in which I stand on is the unceded territory of the Owasso-speaking Upi tribe. The Amamutsan tribal band, comprised of the descendants of indigenous people taken to missions Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista during Spanish colonization of the Central Coast. As today are working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices of these lands and heal from historical traumas. It is really wonderful timing for Ken, for you to join us from Los Angeles. In particular, the image that you share in our first slide is one that is entitled Failed Democracies. And it couldn't be a more relevant time to be having the conversations that I hope come up in your presentation and in our conversation today. I'm going to now start sharing, and we will go through Ken's presentation. This image here, Ken, is one that I want to circle back around to perhaps at the end, one in which we can think about the ways in which a project that was conceived years and years prior to its implementation on this billboard through the Four Freedoms Project, and to contemporarily bring us to the politics of what's happening in the country today. Our first slide, I want to pose a question just to start us off, Ken. And one question that came to mind as I was thinking about your work and thinking about all of your life's work as a multitude of different series, gesturing at the same ideas in various other ways. As an artist and as a researcher, how does art produce knowledge compared to other disciplines? And how do you use similar source materials to different ends? And maybe that can be a jump off point to lead you in to your first slide.
Sure, and I think that our intention is to do this, try to be as conversational as we can, which of course is difficult to do in Zoom. But I think, yeah, we're trying to think of how to articulate the practice within the larger framework of both the program you have at your university and of course other and current events happening right now. So this particular tree was one of the actual historic lynching trees in the state of California. And as many people probably know, I wrote quite a lot and have researched over 354 cases of lynching in the state of California. And many of the cases, it's very hard to find the location. So a lot, and we'll talk more about that as we get to some of them. But in this particular case, what I like about this one as a place to start is it's recognized by the state. It's one of the few markers in the state of California. And in this particular case, in all likelihood, the tree was moved. So you can see it's sort of strapped to this base. There's a cement thing in the middle. It has been said that it was across the street down the road. And basically this small motel may have, or the owners of the property may have brought it closer to this motel as a sort of a tourist attraction. And so that question of what is real, what is true, and then the question of what a photograph does. So to get back to your idea of the art. So I've taken a photograph of this thing that is, I suppose, a tourist attraction on some level. Mm-hmm. And yet in the context of seeing it in a museum or in a university setting like this, the meaning of that word changes. So when we think of all the things you drive by on the highway, the markers, the roadside activities and things that are meant to sort of entertain you, this is transformed through an artistic practice that is based on research, based on data. And so it's a marker, it's a representation, but it is not a documentary representation in the sense that that we might imagine when we think of photography.
Thank you. Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of conversation. I hope I have a lot of questions about this area in which your work lies, which a lot of contemporary work that uses the archives and historical material, the spaces in between documentary practices and art practice, and where we find ourselves in this concept of truth that constantly is somehow really the thing that always brings us back to photography, is this notion that somehow there is some truth behind the document. Can you tell us about this photograph?
Sure. So this is part of the larger project, which was called Searching for California Hang Trees. And basically, after having done this research, basically assembling historical documents, looking through microfiche, old newspapers, historical accounts, and then basically being told repeatedly by historians at well-respected universities that I'm an artist, I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm Latino, I'm overly sensitive, and you can find the records of these conversations in the early documentation of the project. And so out of a sense of frustration and as a visual artist, at some point I was in a library somewhere in Sacramento, I think at the State Archives, and I was reading about the killing of a Mexican or Mexican-American in the 19th century. And I just started thinking to myself, that's not so far from here, the location they're describing. And so I just left the library, got in my car and started driving and started heading to look for that spot. I didn't have enough data to find it exactly. And many of them, the information is very loose. It says near the corral gate or out 100 yards from the sheriff's office or something like that. So one of the reasons that this history has been overlooked by everyone up until now, right? There are no, at least when I started the project, there were no other projects on it, was that this sort of impossibility of documenting, of verifying, of finding the so-called truth was part of the challenge for historians and also part of the challenge for finding a way to represent it. So the project was about searching, literally, that this person went searching for these sites, and I thought of the trees as witnesses in some sense, and this idea of the landscape as a witness. And I also was using the 8x10 Deardorff camera, which for camera people is the old-fashioned camera used by Weston and Ansel Adams and others to construct a fantasy image of California as this empty space ready to be, inhabited. And I wanted to create a project using the same tools, the master's tools as it were, but that would allow for a chance to think about the histories that are missing, the stories that aren't told. And so part of the way I do that is through the conceptual framing of the project, and part is through the naming of the images. So most of the titles for these are taken from historical accounts.
Yeah, I was just going to ask about, oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to ask about this title in particular and how you conceived, how you can tell us, with none but the omnipresent stars to witness. And the title in so many of these works are just as important signifiers to the research and to the source material of the archives. This morning, I revisited Kate Palmer Alber's book, Uncertain Histories, and her text in regards to your Erased Lynching series work. And one particular section I just want to quote in her book, Uncertain Histories, Accumulation and Accessibility, and Doubt in Contemporary Photography. Kate Alpers writes, to quote, she writes, he digitally removes the bodies of the hanged to redirect a viewer's attention from the spectatorial to the contemplative. Denied the visual gruesomeness of the dead body, the viewer must consider instead what it means to have erased these hanged ladies, and by extension, what is meant that such scenes were photographed and circulated in the first place. The Erased Lynching series demonstrates the profoundly visual nature of lynchings and seeks to interrupt the circuit of cruel spectatorship and visual consumption. I particularly want to bring this forward because I find that this concept of the interruption of the circuit is at the root of your work, quite, and it is sort of rhizomatically and spread throughout all of the bodies of works. So I want to also pose a question, Ken, to think about how your practice as an artist, as an intersectional living body, witnessing these spaces currently and then documenting them, as you said, with a large format camera, going to the place, searching for them, not necessarily being able to locate them as markers, but really on this, practice that it is embodied of your own body, how one is able to activate and challenge the archive. And I think that this in particular, I think it feels that there is a confrontation of a similar sense in the way that you choose to install the work in this exhibition installation as well. And then of course the text, the book, The Lynching in the West, where all of your research that hadn't been really covered before. I just want to ask you personally, how did that feel to have to take on a such a large gap in our history that didn't cover the lynchings that did happen in the West of Latinos, and lynchings that perhaps were not archived in the way that you were able to archive in your book, Lynching in the West?
Yeah, so that's a few different issues, but in terms of thinking about the installation of this series, so which I think is the sort of segue you were getting to, of trying to think through the photographic image in terms of thinking about the archival image that we'll get to in a moment.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, for those not familiar, the cover of the book did have an erased lynching on it. So there were originally 3 bodies. The last Latino lynched in 1920 in Santa Rosa, right near you, not so far from you guys. And I went looking for that site, and that tree appears also in this, that location appears also in the series, not the actual tree. The tree was cut down shortly after the lynching. And the installation was in Medellin, which had its own long history of historical sort of political disappearances. And so actually when the work was shown there, it seemed that people actually understood it very well, very easily. There was that it was about a history that was not visible. And I was sort of amazed that it communicated in the way that I had hoped. We did have a copy of the book nearby, but really the idea was to create an artwork that could do something that the historians had not done yet, right? Mm-hmm. That had not yet been recorded, that had not been internalized, had not been taught. And so to try to see that the trees as part of a larger project. And for me, the whole thing is one project. So I always sometimes joke that the book, Lynching in the West, is really just a very long artist statement. You know?
Yeah, I thought of that too. I mean, I really do feel that there are 4 components in this work. But again, I think the work that we'll get to later too is, I mean, all of the work is interconnected for me. This is a close-up of one of the images, Nightfall 2, that was in that installation, as seen here. And then at the Garanali Foundation in Vienna, how was the work perceived there in such a different context?
Again, there were a lot of overlaps in the sense of thinking about the Holocaust and thinking about the invisible histories in Vienna, right? All of these sites and locations, and even the difficulty of naming difference there, and thinking about the kinds of differences that signify. So in that sense, I think there was a lot of interest. They were among the first to show the work, you know, so there was a kind of a curiosity, I suppose. I think there might have also been some of the questions of the American West as sort of an imaginary for many people in many parts of Europe. And so it really provoked them in ways that they had not anticipated.
Mm-hmm. And here I want to bring this up too, because eventually I see that scale becomes this really significant component in the way that you're taking the document and asking us as audience members to engage with the work again. to confront the images. Here, this large wall piece as seen in Paris. And then here's a image that, from what I have a question, I guess, as to, is this image what led you to then move into the film production piece, to think about the film work that is called Run Up, which is a short film inspired by California's last documented lynching of a Latinx. You conceived and photographed a series of a stage tableau, which speaks to that photographic history of recreating historical events. And my question in this piece is, what role does fiction have in your research-based practice? Does the audience shift for you? Do you think about truth speaking? And here's that idea around truth again. Truth speaking photographically, documentary practices, and that thin area in between documentary art and fiction. And before I play this clip, please feel free to fill us in on maybe the aspect of production, if you'd like to go into that. But I'm really interested in the role of fiction in your work and what this area is for you between documentary and art production.
Would you like me to answer that before you show the clip? Sort of set it
It's
up.
up to you. Do you want me to play the clip first?
I think so. Then people at least know what we're talking about.
Okay.
It's short. So in terms of getting to your question about this, the question of the fiction, I had originally written on the case, and it's actually the cover, the same case from the cover of the book, which I had written on very early on in researching the project, but I never had very much information around the case aside from the newspaper accounts. And what happened was, just prior to making the film, which corresponded with the police shooting of Michael Brown, I found the coroner's transcript for the historic case, which was written not around the lynched men, but around a police officer they had shot in sort of a shootout. And then they gave these, basically had this long transcript of the dialogue describing the events of the night before. And so from my understanding and my research, there's a very high likelihood that it was actually police that killed these men that were in custody. And so I wanted to create a piece that talked about the overlap between the history of lynching and the history of police killing, right? Which is as old as the history itself, and to try to bring a parallel to California and to the kinds of police killings that were happening here and were against Black and brown people in California, and trying to raise awareness that there was historical precedent for it. And so I used the the coroner's report, which had new information as the basis for something that I imagined as being a script. In the end, the project, like all of the projects, were imagined as installations. And so the installation included what is actually an 8-minute film, the still images, and then some images I shot in Ferguson in the aftermath of the Michael Brown shooting. And so the whole show was meant to think or to suggest that there were larger connections between the present and the past. And so the fiction, in a sense, is of course it's staged that and cast and costumes and all of that stuff. But I was trying to create, if you think of an installation, an experience that the viewer could really get involved in or get sort of swept up in. So even if you think back to that Paris shot of the corner installation, the idea that that was really not a flat photograph, but a sculptural work that happens to look like a photograph, right? And to encourage people to stop thinking about photographs the way they often do, as flat two-dimensional objects. They're, in fact, and I often say, they're just very skinny sculptures, because they have fronts and backs. In this particular case, the viewer has to decide to engage. It's on 2 different walls. You have to choose to look at those walls. So, so I was trying to get at the culpability of all of us as viewers, as consumers, as creators, as image makers, in this sort of cultural production that then produces and reproduces and challenges and alters and creates a new model and
Yeah, and the eye level, right? Installing also the eye level of the face is one in which if you walk by, you're asked to think about who these witnesses are that are bearing witness to this tragedy, and to think about how, as a group, individuals participated in this spectacle, this horrible spectacle.
And that installation may not look it, but it was 20 feet by 60 feet. So it really did fill the space and take you into a different place.
Mm-hmm. And then moving on to the Smithsonian, I want to talk about institutions briefly, more so in particular in the ways in which, as an artist, I have a lot of students that, and I'm sure you have this question come up too, is, how did you get access to the Getty? How did you get access to the archives at the Smithsonian, or to have time to photograph and to be able to get to specific archives and present them? Or are they copywritten? Who owns the photographs? And these questions of morals and ethics of what does it mean then to alter them, but then what does it also mean to present them? And I know that's a very difficult conversation, as I know that it's also very complex and nuanced. But I think that the installation here at the Smithsonian in particular brings a lot of that forward for me in particular. Here's another image where we have this entitled Unseen, Our Past in a New Light, and of the National Portrait Gallery installation. You actually are then showing these larger scale archival images. So can you talk a little bit about your process in regards to getting access to be able to reproduce images, and how you navigated that with institutions such as the Smithsonian?
Yeah, you're right. That is a very big question, but I think I can do sort of a mini version. And we'll be looking at some more examples of the sculptural objects in a few slides from now. But basically, the first part was to get access as an artist, scholar, researcher, to have access to the collection. So that's always the first part of it. And then the second part is to try to figure out how to get the photograph, meaning sometimes I have to, security has to be with me, or I have to schedule specific days, or something's in a crate and has to be uncrated. So that's a lot of logistics. And then after that's done, then there's the question of display, which is, in the case, depending on the circumstances, particularly for the Native American bust that I photographed at the Smithsonian. We then reached out to try to find descendants and to try to contact communities and at least share the information of what the intentions were. In a lot of cases, since these are not artifacts per se, like a bone or a skull or something like that, they're representations, photographs, casts, plasters, things that stand in for, and were often displayed as educational, elements. So so that's part of it. And so basically I have, particularly in the Smithsonian, I took many objects that I've not yet been able to show because we have not yet, or I have not yet been able to do all of the groundwork there. Above that, as a photographer, I do have, like anybody, I have the right to free speech. And so the photograph is a representation of that. If in the case of these archival images, it's on top of somebody else's work, then I copyright the work, but I copyright not their image, since their image is their image. I copyright my change to the image. So in this particular case, it's only that little section where I've altered and removed the body and the rope that I suppose is the artwork, and that is recognized by the U.S. Copyright Office and as an action. And so one could say whether that's I guess others have emulated this strategy, and so that question of what is one's work and where does it begin and end is ongoing. In this particular case, this is one of the ones that was blown up for the Smithsonian, and I should say the National Portrait Galleries has a mission to represent the people of our nation, and has been struggling to find ways to represent Latinx communities. And so if you recall back from that installation, I showed them, it's a room full of erased lynchings. Basically, it's a room of emptiness in which the absence is the only representation I was able to kind of construct. In this particular case, you see a group of American soldiers. We can tell this from their costumes, which were uniforms, which I identified and dated, and they're smiling gleefully after they've lynched basically a Mexican or Mexican-American along the U.S.-Mexican border. And so the creation, as it were, is not simply the archival research, but is actually the absence. And of course, the space where the figure was, I filled, early Photoshop. But I think the point is about the idea of that the absence is a presence, and that the presence is what we might think of as the intentionality, right? Or the concept or the framing that allows us to imagine that there's a different voice beyond the voice of the originator of the archival work.
I see that also in the verso of documents, right? If when you're in an archive and when you're actually physically able to look through files and folders and things that aren't maybe perhaps even digitized, but when you're in this physical research mode, to be able to turn, for example, the postcard over of this circulated image that was probably printed in a set of multitudes, but to think that then it is inscribed with a text that is just as much a signifier of the moment and of the action,
Yeah.
such as this one. This to me is just as powerful as seeing the erasure and the audience and the participants, putting things in text on top of having a photographic representation is quite, there's something in a combination of those two, such as also seeing, I love this slide just to show the process of, the Macbeth chart and being able to document the tonalities within an archival image. This one, were you able to find dates often? Because I feel some of them don't, just by working in the archive, many things are not dated locations. Like, for example, in the last one, the location was unknown. And when there was locations, did you feel like those were somehow revealing of a particular mode of thinking in regards to documenting a location, a time and space, and when it was absent, was there an indicator of that specifically as well?
So one of the reasons that the project is ongoing is in a sense because I keep finding information. So even the titles of the pieces have changed since the very first one, because some of those very first ones I found, I now have more information on them, which has taken years to, and so I go back and update the various museums that have them. In this particular case, it's a copy of a copy of a copy, right? So which and I think the next slide actually sort of goes at that idea, which I use a lot for my students, just to say that sometimes it's hard to figure out where the art is. Like,
Right.
where's the art? What did this guy do? He just took pictures of the pictures. So, try to use this one as a way of thinking about all of the layers, all the actions, all the meaning that happens between the real event, which none of us were at, right? The photographic negative taken by the photographer, the kind of camera he used, the kind of paper it's printed on, the eventual erased version, the exhibition version, the slide version we're looking at, my intention, its reception, and the way it's received by others. And all of these things are changing the work and adding to the work all the time, and questioning the work all the time. So part of what is interesting, I suppose, having done it, is having seen how the conversation around these objects changes. So it keeps changing through time. And so part of the project was about trying to recognize that the photographs are not flat, two-dimensional. It's not your screen, it's a thing in space. And so the back of the postcard shows where people have touched it and stained it and written on it, and this shows how it was, indexed and archived and cataloged and is in in an archive somewhere. And so all of these things are part of the way that erasure happens. And when we want to think about the construction of whiteness or racialized violence, we have to think about all of the invisible or unspoken things that block our ability to perceive history that we haven't been told.
Yeah, we were just yesterday or the day before, I presented to my class the Body and the Archive text by Alan Sekula, and we very much are obsessing around the ideas of the construction of race and how the body has been archived in history. And your work is a great segue also into addressing that text when we get back to it. This is an installation of just another installation of the Erased Lynching series. And as you said, this is going to be an ongoing project. How do you know when you're done with the work? Or do you intend it to always be, breathing as a live archive and a live gesture to push up against history, to bring more and more forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so all of I mean, one could use the internet and Google a bunch of images these days, but all of these are the majority of them are from actual objects that either I own or I photographed, or copy prints from archives from collections where they are. So the vast majority of them are actual objects. I think there's a few that might have just been reproductions of reproductions. And so part of it is of course, we've all seen a certain number of images, and far more than we really should ever have to. But then there's many we haven't. There's many different ones that no one has ever seen, never been written on, never been reproduced in this grouping you're looking at. And so this is actually they've never all been shown. The most I ever showed was 2 sets at the Smithsonian. And so this was a mock-up of just of how the 4 sets would fit together.
Oh, wow. In particular, there's 2 images that look like colorized postcards with the green grass and the blue sky in the center. Is that the same image reproduced twice, or are there duplicates that somehow would become different versions of the works?
There are duplicates of some of that. In that particular case, that's just human error because it was a mock-up. But there's like 3 or 4 that have the hand color or the fake color, and I think I have a corrected version of it. But yeah, this was just the mock-up. So the actual thing would be 4. They're all 4 totally different. I don't think any exact ones repeat, but some of them I do have more than one.
And moving on to yet again, I have another question for you, Ken, to this idea of bearing witness. You, in this work, it might be good for the audience to know how you were segueing from that work from the Erased Lynching series, from the book to the film to the archival images installations, and sort of those 4 segments of the bodies of work into your research and practice, looking into institutional sculptures and busts, monuments. One question that I have for this work, where I yet again want to talk about how you play with scale of the objects. I thought that what it would mean for you to bear witness to these various sculptures is quite interesting yourself, again, as one that is similarly going to witness images that are documents of an event, of an historical event. One looking at the object in the archives, one also searching for the tree that is maybe non-identifiable, but then also to shift your mode of practice into thinking about what is record, and to bear witness of these various sculptures that are set in a very completely different environment, one that is an institutional environment. And then you chose to position them in, yet again, a fictional constructed confrontation sometimes with each other. How did you decide who confronts who? And when installing the works in physical space, how do you determine their sequence, for example, in a room such as this?
So yeah, first things first, the one in the back, it's a little hard to see because we did the mini slide show today, but it's the Greek slave and Hiram Powers. And basically, I'm sure many people know it, or you could certainly Google it. She's bound, and she was, the story was meant to talk about basically white slavery in Greece, and in the battle between the battle for Greek independence. And then it was shown in London at the Crystal Palace, and then it began to be used by abolitionists as a way of helping white Christian women to understand that slavery was bad. And so this image actually appeared on a great many pamphlets, and were a part, really a very powerful part of the abolitionist movement in the United States. So a lot of times people talk about notions of whiteness, and let's just get rid of all representations of whiteness in the museum, for example. And in a case like this, that would also erase the history of the abolitionists as well. So from my perspective, and this is what they call the pointing cast. So it's got little points, and was used to make the marbles from it. It's plaster, it's very delicate, and rarely taken out of its storage crate. And so, yes, there was a part of, I guess, the research part of photographing the actual object. And then as far as then the next part, so after I photographed everything, then beginning to imagine how that would work in a room. The one, the last of the tribes is a representation of what was imagined to be the vanishing race of indigenous First Nations people. And so you can see she has this long expanse of unknown in front of her, and the others sort of a dialogue. And part of the larger project at the Smithsonian was about looking for representations of First Nations people in our nation's capital. So I was just looking at what they had in their collection, looking at how that collection was displayed or not displayed, and then trying to allow viewers to go through that. And the last room, which we'll look at in a second, sort of brings it through the natural history collection. So I actually worked with 5 different museums objects. This is from the Field Museum in Chicago. And Malvina Hoffman was commissioned in 1930 to cast or to sculpt the 104 races of the world. 104 races of the world, right? Craziness. Before it was all said and done, Loeffler and all those guys came up with as many as 145 races. All of this is in the days leading up to basically the Holocaust and the Second World War. Some of the sort of race theory, American race theory, was very popular in Germany and with Hitler. And so there was a connection there to thinking about the construction of whiteness and its institutional display. And these objects are, again, slightly points of embarrassment for many institutions. And so, and they're plasters, you can see they're crumbling apart. So part of it is also to photograph them before they're gone, to, you know, have a record of what was there and how people were represented.
And here is an example of that. The sculptures then, or busts, being photographed in these institutional settings and then bringing them forward into a constructed frame, the photographic frame here. Can you tell me how you choose who looks at who and who becomes the narrative that is woven together? And could you tell us a little bit more about this one in particular?
Sure. So on the left, the two white women are from the Getty collection. And basically in the back, we have a Venus, a very idealized image of sort of female beauty, very 19th century, very much about whiteness. And in the foreground, we have, of course, a very proper American lady with her hair coiffed and all of that. And on the opposite side, we have two of the busts by Malvina Hoffman of a Japanese woman and a First Nations woman. And so we can see, so they're all women. So we're thinking about ideas of beauty, of course, thinking about representations of women through time and in different museum collections, and then allowing them to see each other. Basically, it's two different museum collections looking at each other, the Getty and the Field Museum. And then within that, we can begin to see difference. Difference begins to happen in how the figure is treated, how the features are rendered, even the question of the color, in this case, these plasters that have some kind of shellac on top. And so all of it speaks to the way that these bodies were seen by institutions and are still seen, and how do we, and are now stored away, right? Or we're not seen in this context. So how do we make that visible? And so part of it is, I guess for me, it's a chance to imagine to give the viewer a chance to think about the possible meanings for us today, not just simply in the past. I think for me, all of these historical objects are not just dead history, they're part of a history that informs our own thinking. And then if we don't learn to critique our own thinking, then we can't really understand what we're looking at.
And that brings me to this next slide as well, where this billboard, you know, as someone's driving by, what have you heard feedback as far as you know, audience members or witnesses to the billboard? Have there been questions that have been posed? Have there been remarks that somehow you didn't expect to come out from this work in particular?
In this one, so it actually had a website address on the corner. So I actually did get a lot of emails from people that drove by and saw it. They'd pull over and write to me and ask me what it was about. I had a number of teachers write me, like grade school teachers and different people. This was, again, two works from the Getty collection, photographed when I was a fellow there. Obviously, thinking about the question of race and difference in this particular case, you know, what do we see? What do they see? And this was also done in the months after the state of California voted out gay marriage. And so it was in the Supreme Court at that time. 4 months after it came down, the Supreme Court did eventually decide to allow gay marriage. So part of it was also thinking about, you know, race and difference and all of the things. Is it desire? Is it antagonism? Is it what is the relationship there, and how might that function? And of course, the space in between really is both a discursive space, right? We can I don't want to say speech bubbles, but in a way we get to imagine what the
Sure.
dialogue might be, or what our own conversation might be. And so I think for me, having watched, hundreds of school children run past these sculptures as fast as they could at the Getty, and just stopping, and they're both portraits of people that lived. You know what I mean?
Right.
What are they doing in LA? What do they do all day long? Who do they talk to? Uh,
Yeah.
how do they relate to the environment that they're in? And so for me, it was part of also thinking about the institution and its representation of the city, how it serves the city, and all of that.
And how you interact with those spaces, but then also to make those elements public. This also is another, well, this is going to move us into the 41 objects, and which I love talking about. This arrangement is yet again only possible from your intervention as an artist, in order to have all of these representations of race, class, um, color, materiality, sort of all in one place, objects arranged by color. How did you arrive? Can you tell us about this project, and also how you arrived at the title, and how you arrived at the concept of arranging them in such a way?
So it's obviously there are 41 objects arranged by color. So the title was, how in the heck do you title this thing? There is a longer title, which of course includes all the museum titles, which would appear in any sort of publication, but this of course is the working title. I mean, obviously the idea was thinking about how race has been depicted through time, and some of the objects go back to antiquity. Some of them are from the Middle Ages, some are from 19th century and 20th century. So I was trying to think from a broader perspective about the idea of how human difference has been articulated in different time periods at different times. There's a few gold-leafed, crazy ones in the middle there from Sanssouci. The first depiction of Asians in Europe were actually created by local Berlin individuals dressed in Asian style costumes, and then the whole thing are life-size and gold-leafed. So it's a crazy, insane, unimaginable representation. And there are, of course, stories behind each and all of them, which would take forever. The woman with the sort of in the front center is the first mannequin, a Parisian mannequin from 1930. So thinking about sort of conventions of beauty, about representation, and quite a bit more.
The other thing that comes up for me is how they're intended for you to interact with as an audience member too, right? The position in which one is supposed to either have a 360 walk around the piece, or how it is installed within the museum or within the institutional setting. For example, that comes up for me in thinking about the infant on the bottom right, and then also the back of the individual, the objects that move, or bodies that move and have clothing and the material. And so all of these different articulations of what someone deemed as significant. And of course, that purpose changes over time, right? And then you're yet again changing it in this presentation, in the way that we're confronted to think about all of those things.
I would just add one, and we can certainly stay here, but just the idea that I physically found all those objects and photographed them. So each one does have a story from a different World's Fair, from a different sort of global moment that contributed to the history of racial formation we inhabit.
And so then this moves us into this work, and my questions around where you are heading now in your work. We've definitely not looked at all of the bodies of work that you have in this presentation, but in particular, thinking about California and again, those notions of the West and the history of the West. Um, how do we talk about decolonization now, and how do we address the histories of colonization? And how do you do that and hope to do that in your own practice?
Yeah, that's a great question. Maybe just go back to the last slide. I'll do it really quickly. So
Mhm.
this was the last room in the Smithsonian show, and basically super mini version. On the left was the traditional, I guess, white American, Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, the kind of bus you might expect to find. In the back, you have America turning her back to us in complete commission, and then on the right were three First Nations individuals that were cast, and I photographed the busts, which were in storage in the National Museum of Natural History. And so part of that project was then about trying to figure out who they were, what their names were, and then I maybe shot something like 80. These were the only four, there was one other one, where we were able to get a hold of uh, tribal councils, tribal leaders, in some cases descendants, and basically at least inform them that we intended to put the work on view. And from my perspective, the project was about looking for First Nations people in our nation's capital. And so now bringing them out of storage and putting them into the National Portrait Gallery, where there are very few. And so that was part of a larger strategy that hopes to to enhance the museum and to enhance our nation. So when we go, we can see the diversity that is America. And so um, you can go to the next one.
Mhm.
So some of those were from the very, and you can just go ahead to the next ones, because I know we don't have a lot of time. So basically, how do I do this? A lot of times I research to figure out how do you find these things? You don't just like go to the internet.
Right.
So basically looking for the history of displays. This was the 1915-16 California Panama Exposition meant to celebrate the building of the Panama Canal. And Herdlicka decided to create a display about basically human difference. So he has First Nations people, whites, and blacks in those three different rows. And in the far side, you see some other sort of early man symbols. And you just go to the next one.
Mhm.
And so in this particular room, you see that there's these two native busts in the back corner. And so after a number of years of looking, probably like 6, I was able to track down uh, this particular bust. And I have other images, but not in this PowerPoint. But basically, um, to identify, you can go to the next one, it's fine.
Mhm.
Here's another example from one from Paris, where, and I just put at the top, I also do the genealogy of a lot of these individuals so that I can figure out where their ancestors would be. And so this was her genealogy, her marriage, and her display that she had two kids living with her for a period of time. The original was lost. So there's one, the copy was sent to Paris, and that one survives. That's what I photographed. The mold you're looking at on the other side is actually a photograph of air. It's the air inside the mold. So you're looking at absence. It's the absolute example of what absence looks like. And so trying to reassemble literally a missing history within the institution. And just there for that moment, I had them together, and then after that, gone again. And you can go to the next one. Just because they do speak to precisely the question you're asking. And so this particular case, again, we have a bust. This was on display in the Louisiana Purchase exhibition. Very hard to figure out what was on view back then. It was based on a photograph, which again, it looks very easy to see it here, but to figure out who this was and to find a photograph of that person, and then to trace it to the clothing and the items to figure out what their actual name is, it was a number of years of work. So for example, you see at the top, I know very quickly, it's called Studio Portrait of Prairie Chicken. That's on the photo card. Well, Prairie Chicken was his wife, and he had gone with his wife. They both had their portraits taken. So his name had been misidentified for over 150 years. And basically, when we went back to the Pawnee, and we said, here's a photograph I've taken. I'm gonna show this in the show. And I shared the information I found, and they said, actually, that's how we learned about the name. They said, that's not his name. His wife was there. His name was a different word, but actually in current Pawnee, they could not agree on what that would be, because different elders have different interpretations, because culture is living. And so the version that they agreed to was that gives to the poor was his name, as they recognized it, and we were allowed to show it in that context. And then I think just go to the last one, and then and so same thing. Basically, you can see the difference in spelling on the bust. We were able to correct the spelling by going, in this case, we actually were able to find his great grandson, sorry, and to share this image with the Osage Nation. And they also valued that the history that he represented. He was the first leader of the basically Native American Christian church that still exists, and was a very important leader for the Osage, and was in DC basically to sign some treaties. And so they made a cast of him when he was here, and then eventually that cast is, made a face and attached to shoulders and all that. And so, so from my perspective, the strategy for the Smithsonian show was to try to bring at least a piece of the history out. And I can say that the Smithsonian actually is going to keep this image. So this one is now a part of our National Portrait Gallery.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, I think as we move into, thinking about as educators, but also as new generations become aware of our archives and the institutions and how they're changing and shifting, how art practice has hopefully and continues to be more democratized. One of the things I want to just thank you for, Ken, in your work is to thank you for your relationship to the archive and the way that in your forensic work and the ways that you bring forward these difficult conversations. And you definitely make me think about my own relationship and many others as witnesses to the work, to think about what our relationships are to the archive in particular today, but also as we move forward. With this material, I think that we'll jump off and invite Jennifer Gonzalez back into the conversation to open it up to the audience for questions about specific slides or anything that has come up in Ken's presentation.
Well, let me begin by saying that your work is so wonderful, Ken, and it was a really lovely thing to hear you in conversation and to start thinking about, there's so many wonderful questions we can raise about how bodies have been represented historically. And I love the way your work does this in really incisive and formally beautiful ways. So that makes the work simultaneously engaging and political, which we always love. So I'm going to start us off with a question. We have a couple of questions from folks who have written in. I'm going to start us off with a question about the question of absence and presence. You emphasized absence, for example, of the lynched body or the missing history of Latinos in the National Portrait Gallery. And clearly this is an important part of your project. But what about presence? And here I'm thinking of the faces of the criminals who performed the lynching. They're very present. What can we make of that kind of a portrait? When we start to think of that as a kind of portrait, what is your goal, or why are you bringing those faces to us? Tell me a little bit more about that in the work.
Sure. So the part of the erasure or absence was speaking to the missing history, but the other part was to make the history visible itself. So we do indeed begin to realize that the lynchings in California look an awful lot like the lynchings in the Deep South. And then we can say, oh, why is that? Maybe there's something about sort of constructs of whiteness or of privilege that are universal, right? That we see, even if we look at the news, the TV a couple days ago, with all the nooses that were there and all of the kinds of mob anxiety, sort of enthusiasm that we see in the lynching images. I was looking at a bunch of them before thinking about, it was too late, we already did our slides, but there are many images. And so this idea of making whiteness visible was part of the project in the beginning. And if you think back 2002, 2004, nobody was really talking about that yet, at least not in my circle. And so I was trying to find a way to think about the similarities between the killing of Latinos by lynching and African Americans. And at the time, people had a very hard time seeing that there could be any similarity between the two. And I think today, now that's not hard for people to see, but at the time, people would get very, very insistent about that. And so part of the project for me was about allowing people to see the history they didn't know and to think about it in ways that maybe they hadn't read in a book. Maybe somebody hadn't told them that story. Maybe the only person going to tell them that story was going to be me. And yes, it's an artist, so they don't believe me. So part of it was thinking of strategies of how to talk about what I wanted to talk about. I didn't want to be looking at dead Mexicans. I didn't want to see, the cadavers in that sense. And I think the other part as an artist, I believe in art. I do. So part of it is that it's an invitation. Like, I may or may not be a good speaker. I may or may not be a good teacher. I may or may not be a whatever. But when you see the artwork, you can decide if you're drawn into it or not. And that kind of value is where I wanted my life to be. You know what I mean? I wanted to create something that would entice people. I might give a great lecture. I might give a great class. But for me, the idea that I believe myself to be an artist, and that the things that artists make are artworks. And so that was part of it.
Thank you. I wanted to say that dovetails, or rather that takes us really beautifully into one of the questions that we have that I just wanted to raise with you from one of our listeners. And I'm truncating the beginning slightly, but the listener observes that the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama, has tried to look at the question of lynching. And the questioner asks, though it is a necessary and powerful intervention, the memorial exceptionalizes Southern racial terror as fundamentally distinct from white supremacist violence in Western states. A central part of the memorial is the replication of the columns that name the victims of lynching. The Equal Justice Initiative has invited county officials to collect and install their county's columns in public spaces. But because the memorial does not acknowledge victims of lynching in California, there are no columns to represent Santa Cruz, Santa Rosa, Los Angeles, and all the other cities and towns across California that were home to racial massacres in the 19th century. Could you speak to this erasure and to some of the ways you think artists, activists can create public interventions that underscore the relationships between the West and the South settler violence? So
Yeah,
your work already does that, but can you say?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I've been on panels with people from the Equal Justice Initiative, and I have asked that question as well. I understand that is not their intent. Their intent is to address the history in the South, and they work very closely with communities there. And I think for some, the question of whether issues of race, of Blackness, are so essential to us as a nation that those must be addressed first. I think that I've certainly gotten some sense of that from them. So they call it a national memorial, but it doesn't represent everybody in the nation. It doesn't represent anybody like me. And so, so I have, so it saddens me a bit. I haven't been there. I think it's doing the right thing. It's probably, it has a different model. I mean, maybe we need to have, and now finally we might actually have a Latino museum. So maybe, maybe we need to build our own monument or our own way of dealing with our histories and deciding what we want to do as communities. As an individual, as an artist, I have created artworks and presented them in very public ways in billboards, like the one we saw in the beginning, which were seen by very many people. to try to say, hey, there's, and I go to anybody asks me to come talk, I talk, because I'm like, I can do whatever I can do in the time I have on this planet to try to raise awareness, to try to articulate the kind of nuanced experiences that Mexican Americans have as Americans and as individuals and as artists and as poets and as writers and as dreamers and as husbands and as wives, and to try to show our complexity and our richness could only make the nation better. If you think about how the kind of anti-immigration rhetoric has increased violence against Latinos, and you could even look at the current numbers of COVID deaths in LA are primarily Latinx. The ways in which our invisibility is represented in body bags, at least in the part of the country where I live.
That's a beautiful answer, especially considering the recent events. We have a couple of them. One of them that I think people are wondering actually is to hear your work that to me to the bottom of this question. Descendants that you talked a little. It seems to me a collective project of making history. So actually, it's a thank you for that question. And the next is actually a question: what kind of emotional response did you have while researching and uncovering these topics and these pieces? That's a really lovely question. How were you affected emotionally by this work?
I was so, I worked so many years on some of these things. It's hard to realize how many years they take, but to be that last slide, to be able to link that dusty bust in a basement that nobody ever looked at, nobody cared about, was never going to be shown in an art museum, never going to be shown again anywhere. Nobody was going to see that thing again. They're all crumbling apart because they're plaster. Literally a history vanishing before our very eyes. To take that photograph, basically to try to go find the descendants, to find the communities, and to share that again. And then of course I sent them a print as well. They then learned about this amazing, he had the highest honors in the community. He had started a church. He had done all these things, and again allowed the community to celebrate his life, because basically that was probably cast was made around 1904, somewhere in there. And so there were no living memories of him. And so that was truly and then it is in the National Portrait Gallery. I mean, whether it's on view or not, I don't know, but that was amazing. That was probably the best story of all of them. Other than that, I think, yeah, it's just been about trying to figure out the histories. I mean, the little girl cast I showed, some of them I have done genealogies for, like crazy genealogy things that have taken so many hours. And I don't always have anybody to share that with, because I can't find where it goes. So a lot of it is just time lost, I guess. But when it connects and it can make a difference, then I feel pretty proud of it.
Can I follow up with, I have another question. I know I'm keeping an eye on the time. We're doing okay on time for now. This question is about the gaze. And you touched a little bit on this when you were talking about sort of setting up sculptures so they were looking at each other. Can you say more about how your work interrogates the photographic gaze and also the implications of looking between races?
It's a lot of different pieces there. So the first part, of course, as a photographer.
Well, sort of, I guess it sounds like.
Good. So the first piece is the photographic, right?
No, go ahead.
And so this idea of the photographer as criminal, we are all criminals, right? Because we photograph, if you think of all those lynching images, and here I am using those images as well. So there's a kind of guilt to photography, to representing, to capturing anything, to taking that image of somebody, whether they consent or not. And then because of the nature of photography. And so that has been something I've wrestled. I was trained as a painter. So I've wrestled with that sort of question of what a photograph is for as long as I can remember. And I'm moving towards this idea that it's really a sort of a skinny sculpture. that it's functioning in different ways than we have been taught, and that needs to be reconsidered at some point. And then the second thing, in terms of locations and placement, because I have seen every object in person, and I have had some very famous photo historians critique me, say, Ken, why don't you just cut it out of a book? What do you have to go look at it for? You could just do all this from home and just Google it. You'd be done. And it's true, I'd be 20 years younger if I did that, because all these years I've been doing this other practice. But for me, there is something about, yeah, we know the 19th century was racist, was biased, but I want to see what it looked like. I want to look at that sculpture that guy wrote on and see what I see. Maybe I'll see something different than what he saw, because there's a little bit of magic in those. And I often say that plaster casts were the first photography, right? Because they're indexical. And so they were collecting these plasters much like people were collecting photographs. And this idea that the vanishing races would be gone and they would be able to study them later. And so when you're in front of them, there is a presence, right? They are from life. I photographed the Frederick the Great's death mask, Napoleon's death mask, and you're in front of them. There's something about that I think provides knowledge that helps me to get up the next day, I guess is the best way to say it.
So I guess Karolina has a question. So how do we move forward? How will photography play an active role in the sculpting of our futures?
That's a great question. I don't know. I think I think because we were all on screens, like my students, we used to do this thing in art school where you have them go look at art, and they would do that physically. But I have students now who are, first year students. They haven't been in a museum, and so the whole basis of the way that I came to understand how one moves through the world is something that may be altered because of COVID, and that relationship to objects, to the social, to the conversations, to all the things that happened in that space that art had opened up after so many centuries, right? There was this thing, and people went there and drew certain people, and certain kinds of conversations happened that don't happen all by themselves. You can't just sit in a room by yourself and, it takes a lot of people to be able to move culture. And so photographers have the great advantage of no longer being photographers. Photography is gone in the sense of what I learned, the camera, the film, the materiality of it. Students have very little interest in that. They're image makers, of course. They're image producers. They're CNN themselves, right? So we've moved past the notion of the temporal, of the single instant, to this notion of the sort of ongoing multi-temporal. We're in different spaces. We're in 3 rooms right now, and we're comfortable. We don't even think about the magic of that we're in. How many rooms are we in right now? So we read things very differently. We look at things very differently. So yes, a photographer, I teach photography. So the challenge is to figure out how to make it relevant. The challenge is, like anything, to give students the tools they need to say what they need to. A poet is a poet. You write poems. If you're a poet, you're a poet. Write a poem. And that is the form that it takes. So image makers need to make images. Politicians need to make speeches, I guess, or whatever they need to do. We all have our own needs and skills. And so the thing that we used to call photography is evolving and changing. The thing we used to call art is evolving and changing. And for our students, they need to help us all articulate what they need, how we can help them, because we know how to have a full life, or at least we did, and to find things that are really gratifying and move us deeply. And I think sometimes it's harder for students when they're not getting to have the full range of experiences that we had to find that passion. So anyway, I don't know if that's an answer. It might have been a little bit too long. Anything
No,
else?
it's lovely. Actually, it makes me think a lot about the question of how images can circulate and what what kinds of speed production of images have today, especially for people who are constantly using Instagram and Snapchat and all the other platforms that we use to sort of circulate our image lives. And it's a very different scene, literally, like a different kind of cinematic or a different kind of scope or scene of image making. And I think that it's an interesting question. And let me pose this to you as a kind of wrap up, and then maybe let Karolina say some final words, which is obviously you also exist on different platforms the way we all have to, whether it's Zoom or our smartphones. Could you say something about what you have found really interesting or exciting about activist work, about critical race work that's taking place in new ways on those platforms that maybe echoes the kind of projects you're doing, or can maybe inspire younger students as they think about following out some of the, let's say, problematics that you started in your own work?
That's a great question. I mean, I was going to say very quickly also, people are, of course, taking images all day long and reusing them and not citing them. So we all need to start acknowledging people's work. I've had so many students sort of appropriate other people's work, people that worked really hard to make that work. So we have to recognize that image making is a kind of speech. And just like any kind of written paper, you have to put a footnote. That said, the great, I post a thing once a week. My students will post 50 things. So I think in a way, what's wise about that is that they're just embracing the image production, the cultural production, circulation of images, and in a sense, the way that they all go out there and are recirculated is creating a very vital space that is certainly an alternative to the kind of class-based, environment-based, old world museum culture. So there's a great potential for liberation. I think there's a great potential to reach out and engage with people. And I know that my images get circulated a bit here and there, and I'm happy if that helps to build a conversation or to create a moment for somebody else. So I think, part of it is we do want to have lots of different voices. We want to empower more voices. I think we just don't want to become a space where we silence each other's voices. I guess that's the part I do worry a little bit about. But I think with good training, we can all get there and be good digital citizens.
Wonderful. Karolina, thoughts?
Thank you so much, Jennifer. It's nice to see you. And Ken, thank you so much for joining us. Always such a complex and great conversation to have with you and your work. And I really look forward to seeing what happens in the next 5-10 years with the work. I'm going to turn it over to Rachel Nelson, who I want to thank again as well for hosting us and having such a great speaker series through the Institute of Arts and Sciences curated, which she'll tell the audience about in just a second. And again, to Chloe Murr and to the UCSC Arts Division. Thank you all very much. I'm going to now turn it over to Rachel Nelson and the Institute of Arts and Sciences.
Thank you, Ken, also for being here.
Hi, everyone. I'm very underlit. So thank you very much. We're going to put up a slide now that tells you about our next events. We have an event on next Tuesday. All the Tuesdays, there's wonderful series to come with the Visualizing Abolitions series. So we'll put up the slide now, and then you can, hopefully we'll see you soon. Thank you so much.